Terry Gerton. I'm president of the National Academy of Public Administration, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event. NAPA is partnering with the Administrative Conference of the United States to bring you two panel discussions focused on the important topic of how we handle presidential nominations and Senate confirmations for key positions in the executive branch. We're 15 into the Biden administration, and we still do not have nominees for all of these positions, much less Senate-confirmed appointees in place. So why is that so hard, and why does it matter? Our expert panelists will dig into these questions this afternoon. But before we start the panel, I'd like to introduce Matt Weiner, Acting Chair of ACUS. Matt?
Terry, thank you very much. I'll be very brief. On behalf of ACUS, I'm pleased to join you in welcoming everyone to this important forum. Before we turn to our first panel, I'd just like to thank first my colleague Jeremy Grayboyce for organizing this forum in partnership with our esteemed colleagues at NAPA, and second, the 6 ACUS members and other ACUS affiliates who have generously agreed to appear on today's panels. They are John Duffy, Renee Landers, David Lewis, Ann Joseph O'Connell, Bertrell Ross, and Max Steyer. And we'll now turn to Professor Ross to introduce and kick off the first panel. Professor Ross?
Thank you, Matt. It's good to see you. Hello, everyone. We're just past the 14-month mark of Joe Biden's presidency. Midterm elections are just over 7 months away, and yet when it comes to political appointments, the Biden administration is still very much a work in progress. The political appointee tracker, kept by the Partnership for Public Service and the Washington Post, tracks 799 government positions that require presidential nomination and Senate confirmation. Of those 799 positions, 188 are filled with persons in termed positions or are holdovers from prior administrations. That leaves 611 to be filled. Thus far, President Joe Biden has selected 493 nominees to fill these 611 positions. Only 317 of those nominees have been confirmed by the Senate. What this means is that nearly 300 of the 799 tracked positions are still yet to be filled. Of those nearly 300 positions, 117 have no Biden nominee, 5 picks are awaiting formal nominations, and 171 are being considered by the Senate. In this next hour, a distinguished panelist of experts will identify the full extent of the vacancies in the Biden administration, assess the causes of the vacancies, and then examine the effects of the vacancies on agency performance, accountability, and other factors. I am Bertrell Ross, the Justice Thurgood Marshall Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Virginia School of Law. I'm also a member of the Administrative Conference of the United States Committee on Rulemaking. I am pleased to be moderating the panel today with distinguished experts on executive branch politics, public administration, administrative law, and the federal bureaucracy, as well as a former acting commissioner of the Social Security Administration. For purposes of preserving as much time for the panelists to speak on the important topic and for you to ask questions and have answers, I will keep the bios very short and encourage you to fire up that search browser for all the information you need on the extensive scholarship, impressive credentials, and government experience of our panelists. First, I'd like to introduce Carolyn Colvin. Carolyn has had extensive multi-decade career in public service at the state and federal level, including a 4-year stint as the acting commissioner of Social Security Administration in the Obama administration. In 2014, the United States Senate Committee on Finance approved her nomination by a vote of 22-2, but her nomination was never brought up to a vote before the full Senate. In November 2020, President Joe Biden named her to the Presidential Transition Agency Review Team, where she supported transition efforts related to the Social Security Administration. David Lewis is a Rebecca Webb Wilson Distinguished Professor in the Vanderbilt University Political Science Department. He studies and has written extensively on the presidency, executive branch politics, and public administration. He will be sharing some of his findings with us today. And finally, Ann Joseph O'Connell is the Albert H. Sweet Professor of Law at Stanford Law School. She is a trained lawyer and social scientist who studies and has written extensively on administrative law and the federal bureaucracy. Ann is also a senior fellow of the Administrative Conference of the United States, amongst other affiliations. Now, if I got to run the show right, we will lead with a presentation from Dave, and then Ann, who will provide us with critical background statistics that focus our attention on the challenges faced in the appointments process. I will then ask Carolyn to provide an account of her experience as an acting commissioner without Senate confirmation. But before turning to the panelists, I want to encourage all of you to post questions through the Zoom Q&A function, and I will try to ask as many of them as possible during the Q&A part of the panel. So let's turn to you, Dave. And the statistics that you have on Senate confirmed positions, Senate committee responsibilities for confirmations, and the number of privileged, appointed, and Senate confirmed positions so that we can get a sense of the broader parameters of the problem that we're facing today.
Great, Bertrand, thank you. It's a pleasure to participate in this conversation. I want to thank our colleagues at NAPA and ACUS for the invitation. I look forward to the conversation. Before we get into more substantive topics, I just want to give a brief overview of the number of positions that exist, what this means for Senate workload, and then talk a little bit about the difficulties that the public, the press, and the Senate itself has in keeping track of these positions. And hopefully that'll sort of set the stage for the things that Director Colvin and Professor O'Connell have to share with us. So let's get a big picture. As Professor Ross suggested, there's a lot of Senate confirmed positions. There's actually more than the Partnership for Public Service tracks. There are 1,322 positions that require nomination by the President and confirmation by the Senate. The partnership does yeoman work, keeping track of what they consider to be the key policymaking positions. Of those 1,322 positions that exist, on January 20th, at the start of the Biden administration, 1,189 were available for presidential appointment. Now, as Professor Ross indicated, some of these positions, folks are invited to stay over from one administration to the next, or for some period of time, but there's a lot of vacant positions there. The number of nominees that presidents are sending over has been decreasing over time. So during his first year, President Biden sent nominees to the Senate for about 46% of those positions available for presidential appointment. The pacing of these in terms of Senate workload is quite interesting. So there's usually a lag in the number of nominees sent over in February after a new team takes over in the White House as they transition from a transition team to the Presidential Personnel Office. There's usually a spike in April as presidents try to sort of get their house in order before the 100-day marker that we compare presidents on. And then there's an increase in June and July, usually before the Senate recess. So the Senate workload fluctuates some over the course of the year. The Senate looks at a lot of these nominees. There's quite a bit of variation across the different committees in terms of the workload. So there are some very high workload committees. So for example, Foreign Relations, Judiciary, and Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions have to deal with a lot of nominees and a lot of positions. So for example, Foreign Relations has 345 separate positions that they are responsible for evaluating candidates for, provided that there are nominees sent over. Of course, that's ambassadors, but it's also foreign policy officials in the State Department, USAID, and some other places. Judiciary has a huge load because there are U.S. Marshals and U.S. Attorneys in every judicial district, plus lots of appointees within DOJ proper. And that's not even considering their responsibilities for nominating and confirming judges. Some of the Senate committees have fewer, so budget, small business and entrepreneurship, or intelligence handle just a few. So there's quite a bit of variation over the year and across different committees, which affects the work that they do. And obviously, given their other responsibilities for reauthorization of particular programs and other legislation they'd like to push through, it's a difficult process for them. The Senate has set up a separate process for about 20% of these nominees, a privileged process where the president sends over a nominee, and then there's supposed to be an expedited procedure for getting them confirmed. And sometimes that's helpful, but I think the data will suggest, and we can talk about this more, that it actually hasn't helped that much in terms of the speed of getting people into these positions. And the last thing I'll say before turning the conversation over to my colleagues on the panel is that one of the difficulties in this area is that it's difficult for outside observers, but also the Senate itself, to keep track of all of these Senate confirmed positions. The primary government source that keeps track of politically appointed positions, the Plum Book, only covers a portion of all the Senate confirmed positions. So it misses about 20% of all Senate confirmed positions. And then the process by which agencies are reporting vacancies when they emerge is quite fraught, and it depends on the sort of willingness or even cognizance among agencies to let Congress and GAO know when these vacancies emerge. So in the midst of this sort of large, expansive number of political appointees, it's difficult to get nominees in and then to get the Senate to consider them. And Professor O'Connell has done a ton of work on the Senate side, and so I'll let her talk about some of the basics there.
Yeah, thank you. Oh yeah, please go ahead, Professor O'Connell.
Thank you. So thank you so much to NAPA and to ACUS for inviting me, and to my fellow co-panelists. This is a topic I care passionately about, and I'm excited to be here. So we're going to leave a broader discussion about the causes and consequences of vacancies to the panel, but I just wanted to provide a little descriptive information on confirmations of agency positions. So using data from congress.gov and looking at all agency nominations, so including Article 1 courts, but excluding judicial nominations to Article 3 courts, at the 14-month mark, so as of March 19th, President Biden has had 399 of his agency nominations confirmed. And I should also note that I'm treating each nomination separately. So sometimes there are concurrent nominations. You're both a member and a chair, for example, of an independent commission, and those are getting counted as two confirmations. So 399 agency confirmations at the 14-month mark. And then if you look at how those confirmations occurred in terms of the vote type, a third of those confirmations required recorded votes, and over half of the recorded votes actually got more than 60 affirmative votes. And we saw the first recorded votes on U.S. attorney nominations in over 40 years in the first 14 months of the Biden administration. So how does that compare to recent administrations? So President Trump at the 14-month mark had 367 agency confirmations. About 23% of those confirmations were by a recorded vote. President Obama, quite a few more. So at the 14-month mark, 550 agency confirmations, and only 5% were done by recorded vote. The remainder were done by voice vote. And if you go back to President George W. Bush at the 14-month mark, even more, 599 agency confirmations, only 4% by recorded vote in the Senate, the rest by voice vote. And indeed, if you look at Biden, you look at Trump, you look at Obama, you look at President George W. Bush, not a single agency confirmation in the first 14 months by unanimous consent. The last time we saw agency leadership positions being filled by unanimous consent was in the early months was President Bill Clinton, had about 194 in the first year, and then President George Herbert Walker Bush had 378 of his agency picks get into place by unanimous consent. So that's some information on where confirmations stand now. And in the panel discussion, I can talk more about nomination failures, so those that are returned or withdrawn, can talk a little bit about confirmation rates. So those were just absolute numbers in terms of confirmations, but what percentage of the nominations, and then also talk about the various causes and consequences. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and thank you, Dave, as well for presentation. I would like to turn to Carolyn, because Carolyn can provide a qualitative and personal account of her process of nomination and confirmation, or working through the committees and then not ultimately getting to the floor. I was wondering if you could describe your experience and when you were nominated, and also if you could sort of provide a comparison and contrast with the process now. Has it materially changed from the point at which you were nominated in 2014 till now?
Thank you very much. I want to commend NAPA and ACUS for this discussion. I think it's very important, and having gone through the process and experienced the challenges of being in an acting position is certainly very much of interest to me. I was appointed acting by President Obama, and as was discussed, I had an approval at the committee level of 22-2, and then the nomination just did not go forward. There was an expectation that there would be some review of some issues that Congress had identified that were of concern to them, that were a carryover from the previous administration. But although the nomination was not withdrawn, it did not move forward. My position was a little interesting because I had been nominated and confirmed as the principal deputy of the Social Security Administration in 2010. And so I was there and simply moved into the acting role when the position became available. And consequently, the law does indicate that if you've been previously Senate confirmed, you can remain in an acting capacity. So I remained as an acting commissioner throughout the tenure for President Obama, and then I departed the same day that he did. The challenges with that are numerous. One, Congress is not especially interested in working with someone that they have not affirmed, and things that don't move as quickly as we would want. Secondly, the stakeholders are very concerned about how long are you going to be there? Are we going to move forward in one direction and then very quickly move in a different direction? I've heard us described as substitutes or caretakers, and I never considered myself in that way because I had been in the agency in two major positions, both the deputy for policy and then later the principal deputy. And so I had long-term established relationships with the staff as well as the stakeholders and the Congress members and others. And so it was a little bit easier for me than I think it would have been under other circumstances. But you have to recognize that you are looked upon by the staff as someone who's only going to be there for a short time. So they're not willing to exert the kind of effort that they would if they know that you were going to be there and you were going to be developing a team. It's very hard to attract people to come in and join your team when they're not certain if you're going to be there tomorrow. And so you have those kinds of issues. I had gone through the confirmation process as the principal deputy. And of course, it's a very challenging process. Also, I was required to give up most of my local activities and things of that nature with the expectation that those would be things to be avoided as the permanent principal deputy. And then, of course, as I began to assume the role of acting, I continued then not to be able to participate in those things, but still the uncertainty of whether or not I was going to be able to move forward. One of the biggest challenges is dealing with the stakeholders, the aging groups, the disability groups, all the groups that represent our constituents, because they're not certain of how much is going to remain in place once you leave, and they have no sense of how long you're going to be there. So I think the uncertainty is not good for the agency. You're not able to move major policies forward. With SSA, we were fortunate because SSA is primarily or more of an operational direct service agency. So we were focused on how do we continue to provide excellent customer services, how do we deal with the backlogs, those kinds of things. But you will note during that period, you did not see a lot of major policy initiatives coming out of the organization. I think that was directly related to the fact that I was in an acting capacity. I can certainly talk further, but I think I'll hold that for the audience to figure out what kinds of questions they might have that I can answer.
Thanks, Carolyn. I want to stick with you, though, on this next question to pose to the panelists. I wanted to talk to you about the source of the problem of delayed appointments, and more speaking in your role as part of the transition team for President Biden with respect to the Social Security Administration and the staffing of the Social Security Administration. What have you found in terms of the challenges from the perspective of the administration, a transitional team, with respect to identifying in thinking about filling that position with respect to the commissioner? I know that there's unusual circumstances with respect to this past election period, the disputed election, of course, a runoff in the Georgia Senate races that would determine who controlled the Senate, and also the fact that Andrew Saul was a holdover from the Trump administration as commissioner of Social Security Administration before he was removed by President Biden in July. But I wonder if you could kind of talk about your role as a transition team and some of the obstacles or strategies and ideas about filling the position.
Well, I think the challenge was that as long as you had the previous commissioner there who was serving a 6-year term, you're going to be limited as far as implementing many of the policy agenda items set forth by President Biden. So clearly, I believe that it was important that there be a new commissioner. I had experienced working under a commissioner that had been appointed by the previous administration when I served as a deputy. Mike Astrew had a 6-year term, had not been willing to leave, and therefore was then moved over into the next administration. So he served 2 years in President Obama's administration before he decided to depart. And then, of course, the process began to try to get a confirmed commissioner, so a lot of time was left there. So I felt it was very important that the president be able to have a candidate of his choice, and was disappointed to see that that has not moved forward yet. The other challenge is that SSA has a very small number of political or non-career positions within the agency. When I was there was only about 8. And I think that under Commissioner Saul, there were even less because he really did not want to have political appointees in the agency. And that creates a major problem. So again, there's the uncertainty of whether or not you're going to have a team that you can work with when you go in, a team of your choice that you can then build into a group that is able to be effective in carrying out the mission of the agency. I think it's very challenging when you have a 6-year appointment that's going to run across 2 administrations. If you look at the record, there have been very few commissioners who have been appointed by Democratic presidents. Almost all of them have been assuming the role of an acting commissioner, and that certainly is not in the best interest of the agency. SSA is a non-political entity, always has been, very competent and compassionate career servants, but they look to the leadership of the organization for their guidance. And when you don't have that, that becomes a major issue. So I think that during the transition, again, because we had difficulty gaining access to the agency during the transition period, it was difficult to really know what the major issues were and what needed to happen when the new administration came in. You had careerists who were able to continue to move the agency forward, and they're doing that now. But if you look at what has happened, you have a significant loss of staff from the agency. At one point, we were up to 70,000. I think the last number I looked at was 58,800 and some. We have a retirement wave that's going to be forthcoming, and we have an inadequate budget to be able to train people and get them prepared prior to this transition of people into retirement. So I think that SSA is not unique. We are one of maybe 3 major operational agencies like VA and IRS and SSA who really interact with the public. And you're going to see the impact on service delivery as a result of those problems, those challenges.
Yeah, we're already seeing some of the impact with respect to the IRS in forthcoming tax season, and maybe and seems like it will persist going forward. I wanted to turn to you, Dave. You've studied executive branch politics in the presidency. I was wondering if you could share with us some of what you've learned about nominee delays from the perspective of the White House and the challenges that the White House has faced as a more systematic, or the executive branch has faced as a more systematic level with respect to nominations.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that's really difficult for a new administration is the immensity of the task of staffing the administration in a very short period of time. So most presidents will begin, and I think the Biden administration began in March before the election had even taken place to begin putting a plan together. But it's not just the Senate confirmed positions, of which there are a large number, but there's also a large number of non-Senate confirmed positions, as Commissioner Colvin mentioned, non-career personnel in the senior executive service, and also Schedule C personnel. So there's about 3,500, 4,000 positions that presidents have to make decisions about in a pretty quick period of time after the election. And if you think about it from the perspective of organizational management, if a top level CFO or COO or CEO of a private sector firm were leaving, we'd take a couple of months to do an extensive search to identify the right candidate. New presidents are confronted with this enormous task in a very short period of time, with intense pressure to try to fill out a team. And when you couple on top of that the kinds of difficulties that presidents encounter in the Senate that Professor O'Connell talked about, it's just an enormous management challenge, and the stakes are incredibly high. And what that means is that presidents prioritize pretty consistently certain kinds of positions over others, which is what we would expect them to do and what we want them to do. But what that means is there are also certain kinds of positions that get neglected systematically in ways that are incredibly consequential for performance. And in terms of those sort of persistent vacancies that Commissioner Colvin talked about, the evidence that we have seems to suggest pretty consistently that her experience is common across the executive establishment, that it's difficult for people to do long-term planning. It's difficult for Congress and the president to invest the resources in an agency where the leadership is uncertain. And it's also very difficult in terms of morale in the workforce in those agencies when you're consistently neglected by the executive branches and they don't seem to care enough to put somebody into place in a permanent capacity.
Thank you, Dave. I want to turn to the Senate now. And my sense is that it takes a long time to confirm nominees. And I wanted to ask Anne whether my sense is right, if she could provide us some background on the time it takes to confirm nominees. And if it does take a long time, why is it taking so long? I know that there were Senate rule changes in 2013 and 2019 that were supposed to speed up the confirmation process. Have they worked?
So, yeah, the Senate is a bit of a mess for a variety of reasons. So first is a preliminary matter before you even get into our confirmation delays increasing, they are, is that like Commissioner Colvin, there are nominations that never get confirmed. So they're not even in the average confirmation delay statistics. So I've called these nomination failures in the past. I've gotten some pushback on the term because, of course, it is not the failure of the nominee, but this is the idea that nominations don't get confirmed and they are either returned to the White House from the Senate or a few are withdrawn. It is incredibly rare for a nomination to be voted down. So you look at nominations that are not even confirmed, and that's increasing over time. So if you look at President Reagan's administration, about 16% of his agency nominations were withdrawn or returned. And then by President Obama, it was 30% over his 8 years of nominations that were returned or withdrawn. Now, of course, some of those nominations are renominated and eventually confirmed. So indeed, at the end of December of 2021, well, really in early January of 2022, slightly over 100 agency nominees from President Biden were returned from the Senate, and they were all having to redo and update paperwork renominated, but some don't, even if renominated, still aren't confirmed. So then let's actually look at those that are confirmed. Delays are also increasing. So the time between President Reagan and President Obama for those nominations that are confirmed have doubled. And you would think we would have had some progress given, as you mentioned, the various rules changes. So in 2013, the Senate decreased the number of votes required for a nomination to actually proceed to a confirmation vote. So just instead of needing 60, just needed a majority of votes. And in 2019, the Senate rules changed in terms of the number of hours of debate time with regard to nominations. But interestingly, the idea was in 2013, it was going to speed up confirmations. And it turned out, even though the Democrats controlled the Senate in the year following the November 2013 change, in many agency types, confirmation actually took longer. Now, more nominations got confirmed, but took longer. And so what's happening? Well, it's a hydraulic system. So it might take fewer votes to get something to a confirmation, or there's fewer hours, but now there are still other mechanisms to slow down the process. And so used by both Republicans and by Democrats. So you place holds, you refuse to give consent at various stages of the process, and the process has gotten worse.
That is quite discouraging to hear that reform has not actually produced the change intended. And I would like to follow up with respect to why the respect for holds and why not the reform of the whole process. But let me just kind of move forward because I want to give time for audience questions as well. I wanted to ask the panelists about the effects of such delays or nomination failures or non-appointments on agency performance, accountability, and other matters from agencies being led by acting officials as opposed to presidentially appointed and Senate confirmed officials. So Dave, I know you have studied the performance of acting officials, and I wonder if you could share with us some of your findings about the performance of acting officials.
Yeah, sure. It's a really interesting question. Some agencies that have sort of a string of acting officials are fortunate enough to have a leader like Commissioner Colvin that has connections inside the agency, lots of experience and respect inside. But in general, I think our findings so far suggest that the average effect of long vacancies is poor performance. So let me just say a little bit about sort of how I make that conclusion. In 2020, Professor Mark Richardson at Georgetown and myself and some academic colleagues partnered with the Partnership for Public Service to send a survey out to federal executives across the executive establishment. And our goal in surveying them was to ask them about their experience managing in the federal government during this time period. So we had also surveyed executives in the Obama administration and then in the Bush administration. And we asked them a couple of things. We asked them, how is your agency doing in fulfilling its core mission? And then we also asked them about agencies that they worked with closely. So we would say, which agencies do you work with the most? And then how are they doing fulfilling their core missions? And we took their responses to these questions about performance and then about some other aspects of performance, and we connected it to data on vacancies and the length of vacancies in various agencies. And so what we found was that in the agencies with the longest vacancies, the average effect was consistent across different ways of measuring performance. And federal executives told us, basically, in the agencies where there are vacancies, and we didn't ask them about vacancies specifically, but just about performance, my agency is doing less well in terms of our core mission. And then their evaluations of other agencies that had vacancies was also lower. And so we pushed a little bit further, and it was fortuitous. It's if Commissioner Colvin could have just prevented us from doing all this work. And we said, what's the reason here? Like, how are you doing in terms of some of the things we associate with good performance? And agencies that had vacancies reported that they were doing less planning for the long term. They reported that they had lower morale among their workforce, and they reported that they were getting less support from outside stakeholders, including Congress and the president, than agencies that had Senate confirmed officials. And so there was a clear relationship with performance. And then there were these mechanisms in between that were very clear that explained why vacancies seem to be having this average effect.
In light of the findings of the study, and it's surprising that you wouldn't have a Senate that cared enough to, in a sense, speed up the process to avoid these delays in appointments. But I just wanted to invite you if you had thoughts on the really interesting study that they've put together, and if there's anything you would like to add regarding the impact on performance and accountability arising from agencies operating with acting officials.
Yeah, so I think Dave and Mark and others, that study is really interesting and disconcerting. I would say a few things. So first, the Senate is not doing, is doing other stuff when it is not working on agency confirmations. And so the Senate is prioritizing its time. And so if you just look in Biden's first year, we got bipartisan legislation, right? The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And President Biden saw a record number of his judicial nominees get confirmed, right? As of the end of December in 2021, 40 Article 3 judges. President Trump had only 19, President Obama only 13. And so legislative priorities, judicial priorities, which was also a priority in the Trump administration with regard to what the Senate was doing, the Senate is viewing that as more worth their time. Now, why do they think it's more worth their time? I think because in many agencies, you can have the agencies function, maybe not as well as desirable with acting officials. And so you can have someone like Acting Commissioner Colvin in place doing a great job, and maybe it's not as ideal as having a confirmed commissioner, but the agency is functioning pretty well. And so the incentives, because the Federal Vacancies Reform Act of 1998 allows for such extensive acting service in so many agencies, there's less pressure on the Senate to confirm. So we can talk about possible reforms there. But I also want to mention there are some agencies that don't have acting officials. So the Merit Systems Protection Board, which deals with protections for whistleblowers, among many other important duties, from January 2017 until early March of this year, right, over 5 years, that agency lacked a quorum. And by the time it got to confirmations, which established its quorum at the start of March, it had a backlog of 3,600 cases. And so that is incredibly disconcerting, because it's not even that you have kind of worse performance by acting officials. You have no performance whatsoever, at least on certain duties. Now, of course, the MSPB was doing certain actions in that 5-year period, but it couldn't do core ones.
Carolyn, I want to give you the last word before we turn to the Q&A, and also invite the audience to add their questions to the Q&A function. I want to focus again on the Social Security Administration. And as you mentioned in your comments earlier, it's an agency that has had quite a few acting commissioners, and I didn't know the partisan dimensions of it, in the sense that Democrats seem to get acting commissioners, whereas Republicans are able to appoint their commissioners. I know you've spoken already about your experiences and the challenges that you faced as acting commissioner, but I wanted you to sort of, if you would mind, comment more broadly on what it means with respect to the performance and accountability of the Social Security Administration at a general level to have such a steady stream of acting commissioners.
Thank you. It's very hard on the staff. They need leadership that gives them a certain level of certainty. And I think it sends a message, whether it's intended or not, that the agency is unimportant to the decision makers and to Congress and others when they're unable to get a confirmed commissioner. Ken Apfel was the first confirmed commissioner when SSA became an independent agency. And we've had 6 acting commissioners since 1997. And that has to send a message to everyone, including staff, but also the stakeholders. The Social Security is not important. Now, clearly, we know that for the administration it is, but the fact that you cannot put someone there in charge to run the organization sends an unintended message, perhaps. The other challenge is that when you don't have a political person there who's already been confirmed, who can then move into the role, a careerist who assumes that role, such as the person that took over when I left, Nancy Berryhill, after 210 days, they must step down. And so again, you have this churning. So, policy development takes a while. It takes a while to get people to support a position, et cetera. So you're not going to be able to move those kinds of things forward as quickly. And I think that the exodus of individuals leaving the agency is an indication that people are just concerned that Social Security is no longer getting the attention that it needs because it does not yet have a confirmed commissioner. When we're working with the stakeholders, they're looking to rely on long-term relationships. They spend a lot of time, volunteer time, working with an organization, hoping that it's going to provide better services to those that we who are eligible, and they don't see that happening because the funding is not where it needs to be. The planning process slows down. Morale becomes low, and it is not a good thing. I think that we must see some changes in this process. The vetting process is very lengthy. And then once you have the vetting process, meeting with the background process, getting the investigation by the FBI, et cetera, which I know are essential, but it's a very lengthy process. So the process is too long, and it doesn't give the outcomes that one would expect. It just doesn't.
Thank you. It's a discouraging report on reality right now. I want to turn to the Q&A right now. And we have a Senate that is currently controlled by the Democrats, albeit by the slightest of margins. And we have a president that's a Democrat, and yet we're seeing these extensive delays in the process nonetheless. And so Richard Pierce asked, what will happen when we have an election in which we elect a president of one party and a Senate majority of the other party? Will the president be able to appoint any judges, justices, or officers of the U.S.? And I'll just open it up and invite anyone to answer the question, or I could do the cold calling method from class if you prefer.
I'll jump in. I think it's going to be really hard to get, especially Article 3 judges and justices of the court. Of course, we saw that with the nomination of Merrick Garland. So I think you're not going to see a Supreme Court justice get confirmed. With regard to lower court judges, maybe you're going to see what happens on the agency front with regard to independent regulatory commissions and boards, that of batching. This gets to a later question by Dick in the Q&A, where you batch a Republican and a Democrat a nominee. I wonder if that might be what could happen with regard to lower court judges, that you might see some batching. Now, with regard to agency officials, I'm pessimistic, but not distraught. So I think at the highest levels, you will see confirmations even when the Senate is controlled by a different party than the White House, because the confirmation process provides a lot of power to the Senate. And so if there's no hope for confirmation and we're going to rely entirely on acting officials and delegations of authority or agencies just stopping to function, that is going to look pretty unattractive to the Senate, even controlled by another party. Now, maybe not so much on inaction, but you're going to at least get some people through. There's going to be power through the confirmation process to get certain information from agencies and the like. But I think with rising polarization, and now, right, we have recorded votes on positions that didn't even have voice votes before, right? U.S. attorneys used to be unanimous consent, then they went to voice votes. Now we're on recorded votes, right? That when lower level positions become, for both the left and the right, a test of party fealty, we're in trouble. So I'm very worried.
Yeah, it's a worrying evolution in terms of polarization infecting all manners of operation of our government. Does Caroline or Dave want to respond to the question? If not, I'll move on to the next one. So I guess this would, I'll start with Dave with respect to the question from Alan Balutis. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. He asked, could you add to your list of topics to discuss the one raised by Paul Light in his book on the thickening of government, the increase in the sheer number of appointees? There has been some progress in the management area, for example, CFOs, but any hope for taking some of these positions out of play and needing to be presidentially appointed Senate confirmed positions?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. And one of these trends I think is not always appreciated, which is that there's been a dramatic increase in the number of politically appointed positions over time. So you can just sort of track a relatively steady progression from 1960 to the present in terms of the number of politically appointed positions. That's Senate confirmed positions, but also Schedule C positions and some of these non-career SES and other presidential appointees without Senate confirmation. And so there has been an increase in these positions. One of the difficult patterns that sort of affects our administrative state is that new administrations come in and they use as a map what the previous administration did. So if, for example, I convert the Civil Service Commission to the Office of Personnel Management and I increase the number of political appointees in the Office of Personnel Management, a new administration comes in and they say that's the norm. And so I'm going to start from that basis. And it's really difficult to get presidential administrations to decide that they want to reduce the number of political appointees because they'd like to have control. They'd like to have their own people in place. And so we see this steady progression. The difficulty with that steady progression is that there can be increasing layers of politically appointed managers in place, some of them of varied quality or experience. And the more cooks you have in the kitchen, the more difficult it can become to connect a clear goal or mission to sort of operating outcomes. And so that's very difficult. And so even the increase in the number of politically appointed positions has an effect on performance because it generates in that leadership team regular churn and turnover that didn't exist before. So even the sort of basic fact of increasing the number of political appointees is consequential for agency performance, and partly through the mechanism of vacancies, but partly through other devices as well.
Bertrand, could I just add something on the chief financial officer? So the Congress cut Senate confirmation from about 170 positions in 2012, actually got a bipartisan effort. The panel that follows us will focus more on these reforms. But interestingly, with regard to CFOs, the proposal was to cut confirmation from those positions. And they lobbied successfully to keep their position Senate confirmed. And the argument they made was that confirmation provided them with a certain status in the agency, and that was important for what they did. But of course, CFOs are among positions that have kind of longer delays. So, there's a balance to be struck.
May I just add one thing?
Go ahead. Sorry. Yes, please.
I'd like to make the distinction between the Senate confirmed positions and the other political positions. I think agencies do need to have a reasonable number of political positions. I don't believe that they all need to be Senate confirmed. But when you're trying to build a team, you need to have a small core of people that you can rely on who understand what your agenda is, what your vision is, and will be able to help you move forward. When you're dealing with a large bureaucracy like the 70,000 employees within SSA, if you have 1 or 2 or 3, we had 8 political appointees, I'm not certain that number gives you the width and breadth that you need to be able to make the kinds of changes that you need to make in a 4-year term. But I do question whether or not all of those positions need to be Senate confirmed. Now, the last time I checked, Social Security only had 3 Senate confirmed positions, and that was the commissioner and the deputy commissioner and the inspector general. But I certainly think that there needs to be an increase in the number of political positions assigned to that agency. which may thicken it more, but I just think
Yeah.
it's desirable.
Right.
Can I
So
just?
I kind of want to focus. Oh yes, sorry, Dave. You
No,
have
no,
something
sorry.
to
I
add?
just wanted
Yes, please.
to emphasize what Commissioner Colvin said there, which is there's variation across the government. And I think the evidence that we have suggests that the right mix between the political folks and the career folks is sort of what's essential. And the question is, have we sort of gone past that sweet spot in the number of politicals relative to career professionals? And there are places in government where we're well past the sweet spot in terms of the right mix there, because political appointees do bring something different in terms of their perspective and their experience from outside the agency that's useful for the agency. The question is, can we get the sweet spot?
There's a question that I think relates to some of the comments that Carolyn made earlier with respect to streamlining the process for appointees or nominees. The question is from Mohammed Shalman. He has the political appointees, Senate confirmed nominees file public financial disclosure reports, however, which is OGE Form 278Es. However, Senate committee questionnaires usually ask for the same financial information instead of just asking the nominees to submit their OGE Form 278E. Why wouldn't the Senate just use the 278E instead of having the nominee fill out another long form and re-admitting the will? And I think that what at the heart of this question is, what are ways that we might think about in terms of streamlining the process so that there isn't so much paperwork and delay with respect to the nomination process, although it's important to vet strongly any nominee.
So there was a wonderful bipartisan group that was established by this 2012 act that cut confirmation from the 170 or so positions about streamlining the paperwork for nominations. And I should disclose, I actually was one of the outside experts consulted, but that's not why I think the report is good, because I had nothing to do with writing the report. But the report made a series of recommendations, and that dealing with the kind of overlapping requests was one of them, but essentially no action has been taken on those recommendations. But that would be one area to work on.
And then, Mohammed Shuman asked as a follow-up, what's the name of the report again, just to so that he has a chance to perhaps peruse it. And if Mr. Lewis or Professor Lewis would mind sharing the study he mentioned in his comments earlier, that would be appreciated by an anonymous attendee, and that had to do with acting officials and their performance that you mentioned earlier. But go ahead, Anne, in terms of the name of the report.
Sure, I was seeing if I could put it in a.
Oh, you can find it. Yeah.
Sorry, no, I have it. It's called Streamlining Paperwork for Executive Nominations, and it was published in November of 2012 by the Working Group on Streamlining Paperwork for Executive Nominations. And if you Google kind of Streamlining Paperwork 2012, it should pop right up.
Great, thanks so much. So the next question is, speaking about sort of multi-member bodies, what is the effect of delays and failures in the confirmation process on agencies headed by multi-member bodies, in which the members tend to vote on party line basis, such as the FCC and the FTC? There's been these agencies have been in the news lately, particularly the FTC with respect to the nomination process. So, the question posed asked about whether the cause or the effects of such delays in these confirmation process and how they might differ for these agencies as opposed to other types of agencies.
Yeah, if I could jump in quickly here, I think there are several responses here. I mean, the first is that because of the terms of board members and commissioners, even having the vacancy takes time in a new administration. So you may not even get the chance to get the majority until 7-8 months in. And then once you have the opening, of course, it takes time to fill. And because of this batching process where you have to pair a Republican with a Democrat generally, you can often get kind of even splits, which doesn't allow the new president to establish her kind of policy priorities in those agencies. So going back to the MSPB, the Merit Systems Protection Board, President Biden made 3 nominations to the board. but we have only 2 confirmations, right? The nominee to be chair has not gone through. In fact, was one of the 100 or so nominations that was returned in early January and renominated. And so you have kind of 1 Democrat and 1 Republican now at the MSPB. So you have your quorum, but the only things that are going to get through are those where you have agreement on the sides. And of course, there's in the FTC has been in the news, right? In order to get some of these nominees through, there was news articles saying that Senate absences, right, by the Democrats are kind of preventing moving forward. And so like they need every vote. And so that is presenting a problem in those agencies in particular. And it's in those agencies where you're not allowed to have acting officials for the most part. There are a few like general counsels in the NLRB and the Federal Labor Relations Authority where you could have an acting GC, but you can't have acting commissioners or board members.
Can I just chime in quickly on that? There's another aspect of this which is interesting, which is that we thought that these boards were going to be designed to be bipartisan and expertise-based, but to the extent that the appointments process involves batching, that is, you sort of pair Republicans and Democrats to go through the process together, the extremity of those nominees is increasing. So you're increasingly getting very sort of liberal Democrats and very conservative Republicans, so that when there is a change in majority, you're getting more dramatic changes in policy on these commissions that historically tended to be more cooperative and bipartisan, which is kind of a byproduct of this appointments process.
We're kind of at the awkward point of time where we have a little bit of time to discuss. I want to ask just to be brief. I'll just ask one question, a shorter one, but might require longer answers. It as a constitutional right, should the advice function of Senate advice and consent be formalized and transparent? One question, what would that mean? And would that make the Senate more accountable for the nomination failures? If someone wants to offer thoughts on the advice function with respect to the Senate.
Matthew Stevenson proposed in a law review article in the Yale Law Journal some years back, that if a certain time had passed and the Senate had not acted on a nomination, Professor Stevenson proposed that should be treated, right, as given advice and consent. That, once some certain time had passed, we would treat that as confirmed. And one of the questions also gets to that about like a second nomination. I think that's constitutionally problematic, but the Senate could, of course, impose constraints on itself. And the 9/11 Commission has indicated some proposals with regard to this, others, the Partnership for Public Service. But you could think about Congress, the Senate, deciding on a certain level of critical national security, for example, maybe certain financial positions, where they would set a timeline. So within a certain number of days, that nomination would come up for an up or down vote.
So I guess I won't test the limits of time here. I know that we're going to talk a lot about reform proposals in the next panel. So kind of lead off naturally from where Anne has left off. But for now, I want to hope you'll join me in thanking Commissioner Colvin, Professor O'Connell, and Professor Lewis, excuse me, for sharing their expertise with us in this first panel of the ACUS NAPA Appointments Forum. And I will now turn things over for the beginning of our second panel, which will explore potential reforms of the Senate confirmation process. But again, thank you to the panelists, and I hope that it's been informative to the audience out there.
Well, it's sort of interesting. Maybe the more I teach constitutional law, the more I understand that some of these problems have been with us since the beginning of the Republic. Teaching Marbury always reminds us that the judicial confirmation process has been a fraud enterprise for quite some time. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Renee Landers, and I'm a professor at Suffolk University Law School in Boston, and I'm pleased to be here with colleagues on the second panel, which is a good follow-on to the discussion of the problems with the current Senate confirmation process that the first panel addressed. And we are going to talk about potential reforms in the Senate confirmation process, or at least kick the tires on some of the ideas that have been presented, some of which were previous panelists alluded to in that discussion. Sort of bifurcating the discussion, sort of indicates that there are these inherent problems with trying to keep the topics perfectly segmented, because some of the things we're going to talk about today were certainly mentioned in the previous panel, but perhaps we can give them a little bit more detail. I'll give just a tiny bit of introduction for people, participants in this forum who might just be joining us now, and we're not able to see the first panel. But delays in the process for nominating and confirming agency leadership leaders have been blamed for frequent vacancies across the executive branch. And as the previous panel discussion explored, and as the Administrative Conference of the United States has recognized, these vacancies can lead to agency inaction. They can generate confusion among the non-political personnel, the career personnel, create uncertainties among stakeholders, and lessen political accountability. So ideas for reform have been suggested to reduce the delays in filling leadership vacancy positions, vacant leadership positions in the agencies, including, some of the things that were talked about in the previous panel, streamlining the confirmation process, and revisiting which positions should require Senate confirmation and how many positions should require Senate confirmation. So this panel is going to examine the legal, policy, and practical considerations related to these proposals and other ideas for reform that I'm sure will come up. So we are happy to have with us this afternoon a distinguished group of scholars and thought leaders who have given considerable thought to how to overcome these barriers in the nomination and appointments process. And I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, but they may speak in a different order. John Duffy, who is the Samuel H. Coy II Professor of Law at the University of Virginia. Bill Greenwald, who's a visiting fellow with the American Enterprise Institute and formerly with the Senate Armed Services Committee. Martha Kumar, who's director of the White House Transition Project. Paul Light, the Paulette Goddard Professor of Public Service at New York University, and Max Steyer, President and CEO of the Partnership for Public Service. So to get things started, I will turn to Max Steyer. One observation is that at the start of the new administration, both the executive branch and the Senate have to address the nomination and confirmation of large numbers of positions and nominees all at once. So your organization has proposed several ideas aimed at reducing the number of positions subject to the advice and consent process. So why don't you tell us about some of these ideas and what the advantages are that they might confer?
Great. Thank you so much, Renee. And just a big thanks to NAPA and ACUS for putting this all together. And I thought the first panel was tremendous. So, and Joseph and David and Carolyn, you gave wonderful insight into the nature of the problem. Renee, I just will leap off of a comment that you made, which I think is so important, which is that these are problems that go back a long ways. Paul, you suggested likewise that this has been an issue for a very long period of time. One thing I would note, however, just for a second on the problem side before moving to solution, is that in my view, the world has gotten a lot more challenging and moving a lot faster, and therefore the consequences of the broken system, I think, are more profound in terms of the risk that they present for us as a society, and therefore the need for action is even more intense than it's ever been. So focusing on not admiring the problem, but actually solutions, I'm going to run through 6 buckets of ideas that we outline in various of our publications, but I'll try to give a very, very quick Cook's tour of them. And the first and most obvious of that is to reduce the absolute number of Senate confirmed positions. Everyone right now loses. We heard in great detail the challenge of the fact that many positions that you don't even see a nominee for. Senate is losing because they're not actually voting on anybody. You have leadership in place that isn't confirmed, that is not actually reviewed by them. And so we really need to reduce the numbers, and how we would recommend really in 3 ways. Most prominently in terms of the consequence would be a review of the assistant secretaryships for those that are going to be reporting to someone who is Senate confirmed, to preview a conversation with John shortly here. But many of them who we frankly don't believe require the Senate confirmation. And we've seen some of the advantages in 2011 when there were 160 some odd removed from Senate confirmation, a number of assistant secretaries of legislative affairs, public affairs. And I just spoke to an assistant secretary for administration who got put into place right away at the beginning of the last administration. Would never have happened but for that change, and made a big difference for the work that she was able to do. Number 2, we need to assess the chronically vacant positions. Again, coming back to the purpose here, it serves no purpose to have advising consent if these jobs are never actually put before the Senate. And we know that there are very, very large numbers of them that are not. So we should be examining those for lots of candidates for removal. And then third, there are very large numbers, over 200 part-time positions, boards, commissions, that once again clog up the system or don't get acted on, and that are easy pickings in terms of trying to reduce the absolute size of number of Senate confirmed positions. So that's bucket number 1, most important. Second, or actually a second part of this is that we believe there should be a reduction of the overall number of political appointees. The reality is that, as David indicated, they've doubled since the 1960s. They really are the entourage. I agree with Carolyn that some small number are necessary. SSA is unusual in the number, how few they have. Many agencies really have way too many, and again, happy to go into detail, but that's a big part of the problem in terms of lack of clear decision making. They really do clog the system. So number 2, we need to look at the changes to the privileged nomination calendar, Senate Rule 31 on return nominations, and other Senate processes. And the Senate actually controls, doesn't require legislation. They can change it themselves. It would make a big difference. We heard, from Ann Joseph, the difficulty of over 100 nominations being returned to the administration at the end of this past Congress. It's a big problem. Doesn't have to be that way, and the default can be reversed. So there are lots of ways in which, between the privilege calendar and some other Senate rules, that you could improve the system dramatically. Number 3, and this one is probably a little more difficult in terms of the pluses and minuses, and Carolyn talked a little bit about this, but we really should, in my view, expand the holdover tradition. And I think one of the success stories that we're seeing right now is with IGs, and obviously the last administration challenged this new norm, but IGs are considered to be apolitical. They're supposed to be professionals. They typically are held over. Most administrations have kept them. And I think there are more positions that should be treated likewise. Positions that are, in fact, technical, that are not policy positions, that are really managerial. And there are plenty of those, whether you're talking about, the Undersecretary for Veterans Health, or you're talking about, some of the, CIO or other positions. Those would be strong candidates where having those be viewed like IGs as professionals that should not turn over would matter a great deal. Number 4, and this is something that Ann Joseph referenced, which I think is extraordinarily important. In the 2011 legislation, there was a important, committee report that was done about things that could improve the system. This is low-hanging fruit. It's there already. It's everything from, reducing and improving the paperwork, getting rid of unnecessary burden on nominees, to ensuring that there's a common, shared form in the Senate, to addressing background investigation requirements that are frankly onerous, slow things down, and are unnecessary, an electronic smart form, on and on and on. There's a lot of possibility for improvement. It's right there. It should be done right now. 5, we have to understand that this is very much connected to the Vacancies Reform Act and modernizing the Plum Book, something that we've also heard discussed in the last panel. I think that would be a huge improvement. And 6, this one, again, may draw some controversy, but I also believe we need to look at increasing the compensation for political appointees to continue attracting top candidates. The reality is since 2014, their pay has been frozen, looks good politically, very bad for the recruiting, and a big problem. And we also need to be able to invest more in the infrastructure of government to manage this process. So to me, fascinating, Presidential Personnel Office. You think about the transition period, there are hundreds of people working on personnel appointments. You heard on the data side, there's a lull after inauguration. A lot of the confirmations nominations actually get slowed down. Part of it is that PPO shrinks. instead of having hundreds of people working on it, they're down to 40 people who we were able to encourage a 1 year plus up of their budget. Made a huge difference, and they could pretty much double their staff side to 80 some people. But we've underinvested in the infrastructure, whether it's OGE or PPO or frankly FBI, to do the security clearances. But anyway, hopefully that throws some things in the pot. Lots to do here, and I'm looking forward to getting it done.
Great, Max. Thank you so much. And thank you for, that was a great transition from some of the issues that were raised in the last panel. And Ann O'Connell actually has a recent article where she talks about, among other things, the crosswalk between the Vacancies Act and some of these issues here that we're talking about today. So Professor Duffy, this might be a good opportunity to get you involved in this conversation. You and Jennifer Mascott are about to publish a piece that argues that the Supreme Court's 2021 decision in the United States against Arthrex may be in tension with the desire to reduce the number of positions subject to Senate confirmation. Could you tell us about the intersection of some of the most recent Appointments Clause and Vesting Clause decisions by the court, and how the intersection with this discussion we're having today, and about the practical problems that might impose on the nomination and confirmation process? I also want to just flag that there's a question from Richard Pierce in the chat about also, this idea of holdovers, or the problem of the terms of years for certain appointments, especially the independent commissions and boards. And the Humphreys Executor issue, a case about the inability of the president to remove these officials, and whether that should be tested. And I don't know if, John, you want to maybe address that as well when you're responding.
Well, let me first address the most recent Supreme Court decision, United States versus Arthrex, which just came down in the last year. And I think that gives us some sense about the limits on restricting the number of Senate confirmed officers in the government, because the Supreme Court in that case held that certain decisions cannot be made just by inferior officers, what the Constitution refers to as inferior officers, who are individuals who are just appointed by the president acting alone, or by the heads of departments or the courts of law. That if someone is, at least in the executive branch, is going to be making a final and binding decision on that branch of government, the court held that has to be a decision that's made through a person who is an officer who's in what the court has previously referred to as the primary class of officers, those who are presidentially appointed and Senate confirmed. That actually is an interesting pushback to the argument that you have to reduce the number of officers. And I'll say that it's not a complete pushback, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the history of that particular agency that was before the court in Arthrex sort of gives you an example, a real world example of an agency that did have the number of officers move downward over the last half century. And that is exactly why the constitutional issue arose. The issue arose with the Patent Office, first called the Patent Office. Later, in the middle of this history, it changed its name to the Patent and Trademark Office, but that's not so important. In 1952, there were fully 13 Senate-confirmed presidentially appointed officers in that agency. That number was increased to 19 officers in 1958. And there it remained until 1975. The day after New Year's, 1975, the number was reduced to 4. That issue, the crucial issue in the Arthrex case would ultimately be that there's a decisional board, as there had long been in this agency, that is required to sit in panels of 3. So with 4, they just barely could muster together a panel of 3 Senate confirmed officers, with 1 to spare. In 1999, that number was reduced to 1. Only the director of the agency, the very head of the agency, who is also an undersecretary of commerce, so below the commerce secretary, was the only person in the entire agency who was Senate confirmed. And that led to the constitutional challenge because this board, which was deciding very important issues, sometimes worth hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes maybe even billions of dollars about the validity of patent rights, those decisions were being made by boards of administrative patent judges who were just inferior officers appointed by the Secretary of Commerce. And the court held that they lacked the power fundamentally to make these decisions. As a remedy, the court held unenforceable a statute that limited the decision-making power in that area to panels of 3 and said the director, him or herself, could pass on the issue independently. And that's where things stand, although there's an additional twist to this, which really points out the problem of too few officers. Right now, there is no director of the patent office because the director of the patent office, like many executive officials, resigned in 2021 in January. And there is a nominee, but I just checked, and so far as I can tell, she has not been confirmed yet by the Senate. So now we've gone for more than a year without anybody in the office, and it is now being litigated in the courts. There's now a challenge to the person who is exercising the powers of the directors to whether that person can actually do it, because that person has never been Senate confirmed. So that's a sort of a cautionary tale that if you limit things too much, you may get into these situations where you have just too few officers in agencies that are making important decisions. I will say that there's also another benefit of having multiple people Senate confirmed. On the first panel, Commissioner Colvin had talked about her experience as being acting commissioner of the whole Social Security Administration, but she was Senate confirmed as she discussed in her presentation. And that is actually the one way to sort of prevent there to be serious problems, or the problem that I'm talking about, which is the absence of anybody who's Senate confirmed. She was Senate confirmed, and she could just step up from being deputy to being acting commissioner, and that didn't cause any problems. But at the agency right now, the Patent Office currently has no Senate confirmed officers, and no, actually, this is something that only people of the Vacancies Act, only people who are real aficionados of the Vacancy Act could understand, but there's actually no acting officer either. It's somebody who's just been delegated powers, not somebody who would be recognized as an acting officer under the Vacancies Reform Act. So there's a real problem here if you have too few, and maybe we need to think about which officers, which agencies, and which functions really need more Senate confirmed people. That doesn't mean everyone, like in the next year's presentation mentioned, like directors of legislative affairs. Those people may not actually exercise a lot of power, may not need to be officers at all of the United States government. They're not adjudicating rights. They're not taking positions in courts. They're just controlling legislative activity, legislative proposals. And some of those people might not need to be Senate confirmed. They may not even be officers at all. But there are some significant costs to reducing the number of Senate confirmed officers. Thank you.
All right, great. Thanks very much, Sean. That was certainly a cautionary tale about not overreacting to the problems with the current situation by making matters worse. And we've all been familiar in recent years with the problems of the agencies that like the Merit Systems Protection Board, the NLRB, and not actually having a Federal Election Commission. Should I dare even mention that one, where there have not been a quorum of commissioners to serve and actually take care of the agency's work. And so your point is very well taken. All right, well, I'll leave the Humphreys Executor discussion for something we get to after we talk with some of the other panelists about their ideas. So Bill Greenwald, let me turn to you now to discuss your observation that presidents have really a limited window of time in which to achieve quick confirmation of nominees, kind of a limited honeymoon period. And once the window closes, You have suggested that presidents should consider populating the positions in getting people, to avoid delays in getting people in place by identifying slates of people qualified to hold the positions and installing them in an acting capacity. So please explain why the narrow window for confirmations exists, and how your idea about a series of acting appointments might work and avoid some of the problems that the previous panel was talking about, like Commissioner Colvin, in terms of, moving the agency forward.
Well, a series. Thank you for having me, and a series of acting officials is perhaps, unfortunately, more of a description of today's reality. But I really would like to rather focus to start off with on timing, and really the experience that I bring from the Senate Armed Services Committee. Time is critical, and an understanding of the history and culture of each Senate committee is, I think, a very important thing that an administration has to look at. And I'm giving you this perspective from the Senate Armed Services Committee, where I spent much of my career, and I think there's some lessons learned by looking at this committee. Not only is SAS the last committee in the Senate that still functions legislatively with its annual NDAA, it is a nominations machine. Over 50,000, and that's 50,000, military nominations are considered and approved by the committee each year. And this is not a perfunctory exercise. This is, having been there and seen what goes through, this is a really staff and member time-intensive function. So the SAS knows how to work the floor process and get things done. Now, of the 1,200 confirmable positions out there in the government, there are only 61 civilian political appointees that the SAS considers for what is essentially half of the discretionary budget. And yet, around half of them were not in place a year into this administration. So this is not a SAS committee problem. This is a timing issue. Because the committee considers, the committee has a history of acting on the secretary very close to Inauguration Day. It averages about 6 to 8 weeks to consider each of those 61 members and report to the floor for those positions. Despite that well-oiled machine, if defense nominees do not get to the committee in the spring, they will not make it through the floor when the typical honeymoon period ends in late summer. Appointees will and are caught up in what is the transactional nature of the Senate floor by July in an inauguration year, if not sooner. So the current and the last administration, for at least defense nominees, completely missed this deadline. And as a result, we're still suffering from this lack of political appointees 15 months into administration. And so the lesson is a slate of nominees needs to get up to the Senate, and particularly to the SAS, a committee that actually works, by at least March and April might even be pushing it. So then go to my point of the Vacancies Act. If the administration is too late to the game, they'll have to rely on acting officials and officials, quote, performing the duties of. And if that's going to be the case, they're going to need to develop a slate of officials to fill these slots and potentially move them around as needed. Obviously, the Vacancies Act has serious limitations on what one can do, but as we saw with the last administration, they can get pretty creative when they want to. And so so far, this has been all kind of ad hocery, but with a more strategic focus to use the Vacancies Act, they could be considered and probably will be considered by administrations that don't get their political appointees confirmed. Since much of the authority in the departments rests with the head of agencies, and something that's been concerned of the Armed Services Committee to prevent another 9/11 problem, it'd benefit the Department of Defense and perhaps other agencies to, once the secretary is confirmed, to name about a dozen senior advisors to the secretary to essentially run the department until the confirmable positions are filled. And the secretary would exercise all authority, obviously, but based on this, he'd be advised by these senior advisors. And these senior advisors should come from past political appointees, individuals who essentially do not want to or need to be confirmed again, but essentially help out in this transition to ensure that the government is protected and hedged against any 9/11 situation in the future. This would actually not be needed if the administration could vet those 61 appointees, at least for this one national security agency, and get to the committee. but that may or may not be the case. And the government's going to have to hedge beyond that. So I know every other committee is different. Committees has broken down on some committees, takes longer, the process doesn't work, but this is at least one option for the administration to consider as they move forward. But the reality is, if they've got a committee that works, they should get nominations in as soon as possible. I thank you and look forward to questions later on.
All right, thank you so much, Bill. And I think that your comments were a good reflection of how, after a certain amount of time passes, that the Congress decides that it needs to move on to other work, or give more primacy to that other work rather than the president's appointments. I think Ann O'Connell brought that up on the last panel. And so I think that the reality of the situation that you're describing gives a lot of credence to her assessment. All right, so Professor Light, since the Senate has some responsibility for the situation, can you talk a little bit about some proposals that have been offered by senators to address the circumstances when a president might be slow to nominate? One idea is that the position would evaporate because of the president's failure to nominate. On the previous panel, someone noted, well, maybe we should reverse the presumption and the default, and that the Senate would be presumed to confirm people if a nomination languishes beyond a certain period of time. So Professor Light, would you like to at least start with the question of penalizing the executive branch for not putting nominees forward?
Well, I think we have to struggle with two different approaches. One is incentives for the Senate to act quickly. Can you remove the painful problems that face a Senate committee that's awash in legislation? Are there ways to accelerate this process that would allow a committee to say, yeah, we got to move on this, but it doesn't have to be as painful as it has been in the past? Now, I don't have a quick and easy list of incentives for action, but we can create some incentives through penalties. And we've talked a little bit about this already. When we ask about too many appointees, when we talk about somehow removing Senate confirmation as a requirement on certain positions, all of these are fraught with historic and well-developed problems associated with agency and incentives. Will committees ever see the loss of a single appointment as a positive? Part of this, by the way, that I look at more recently is the layering associated with the appointments process. We're not talking just about this many appointees subject to Senate approval. We're also talking about how each Senate-approved appointment lashes up in a layer upon layer of oversight within departments. At the end of the day, for example, if you can't get the pork into the ag bill, and the ag bill through the House and Senate, and the money actually flowing, then you don't have action. And maybe part of our approach here is to redefine what the basic unit of analysis is. Is it the number of appointments, or is it the number of layers created by appointments, and therefore the lapses in accountability that occur when you have a missing link in the chain of command? We don't talk too much about chain of command as a concept here, but when you start to look at the effect of vacancies up and down the chain, you start to see the erosion of accountability from the top of agencies all the way down. That's a different way of talking about this. It was somewhat powerful in motivating action during the pandemic to say, well, nobody's home in FEMA, nobody's home over in agriculture. Remember the food box problem, where we couldn't get food out the door and so forth and so on. So maybe what we all need to do when we talk about the need for reform is talk about real effects of the lack of reform. Are we making fundamental mistakes in policy? Are we creating real damage down the chain of command by not moving quickly? I'm all in favor of talking about the numbers, and we've been doing this for a long time. They're horrific. But the argument is not working, and we've got to figure out a way of incentivizing action on it by saying, this is good government and you're responsible for government failures if you don't act, or dealing in some way with automatic action against committees. Perhaps we should start taking nominations away from one committee and shifting it to another, but wow, is that a loaded set of fights that we would generate. We need incentives that reward committees for doing the right thing, but we need strong penalties when they don't. And I'm still struggling with it. Let me give you one last point here, because we did struggle with this back in 1988. We've talked a little bit about this together. When the Presidential Transitions Effectiveness Act was being drafted, the notion was, well, how do we accelerate the appointments process? The notion there was, if you couldn't fill a Senate confirmable appointment within a specific number of days, there would be an automatic elimination of the position, not of the opening, but removing the position. Now, that was too much for many folks to tolerate, but what is the price of failure here? And we got to struggle with it. One option is to say, if you can't do it by a certain number of days, we'll pass it to another committee. That's rather frightening task. You could say, if you can't do it within a certain period of time, we'll remove it from Title V or in the code, and we'll just take it out of there. That's it. Is there any punishment that we can come up with that might lead a Senate committee to say, okay, we better move this quickly? I can see Max on my screen over here. Max is kind of saying, nice try, Paul. This ain't gonna fly. But I don't know what to do at this point. We've been working on this for years after years. And I think some penalty to the Senate for bad behavior is warranted here. I just don't know what it would be. We got to find the soft spot and pursue it, perhaps by eliminating staff in the Senate committees. Wow, that would be difficult, but maybe there's an alternative to this.
So that's very interesting set of ideas, because in the, sort of in other contexts, those ideas actually might have some traction, in a corporation or something like that. The other, I think that perhaps we should recognize at the outset here is that our whole conversation today depends on some shared understanding that the government has to do certain things, and that you need people actually working in the government to give effect to those, to the tasks which the agencies have been assigned. And I actually don't think that we have shared agreement about that notion anymore, and that's one of the reasons for this conundrum that we're in. And Paul's solutions might actually feed into that that distrust of government or undermining of government that has been sort of part of the recent popular debate. But I'm just putting that out there for people to think about when we get to the questions. But I want to give Martha time to point out what she sees as some of the recent successes, perhaps. The first thing I want to acknowledge is that her White House Transition Project has developed a series of office briefs going back to based on interviews with people who have occupied significant positions since the Nixon administration, and organization charts that show how offices have evolved and agencies have evolved since the Carter administration. And I know that you have observed that the Biden administration has adjusted to this history during this in order to achieve some kinds of success in making appointments as the time to achieve confirmations has increased, as the previous panel and our panel has acknowledged. Now, why don't you tell us about what you think that some of those successes are, and why what this administration has done to try to circumvent those delays in the confirmation process? You never can find the mute button when you want to.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm used to it by now. What I'm going to talk about is reforms that candidates themselves can adopt, things that don't need legislation, and that is the concept of starting early in a transition. And so I'd like to talk a little about what starting early has meant. That has meant in the Biden administration. I mean, when you think of all the chaos that surrounded the period between the election and the inauguration, and to have the inauguration occur at the time and place that it was scheduled, that that a lot went into to making that happen, and I think one of the factors in an early transition is having people who value starting early and know what gains they can make. In Biden's case, that was true of the candidate, and it was true also of two of his primary friends and advisors over the years, Ted Kaufman, who ran the transition and who was a senator from Delaware and worked on transition legislation. So he was in a very good spot to talk about it. And Mark Gittenstein, who worked with Biden in the Senate Judiciary Committee and has been a close associate over the years, and who currently is serving as ambassador to the EU. Kaufman said that what he wanted to do was be prepared when Biden came to him. He didn't know when he would do it to talk about transition, but whenever it was, he wanted to be ready. And so he and Mark both met with David Marchick from the partnership and Dan Hyman. They brought the two of them charts showing patterns over the years and confirmations, and that gave them time to think about, did they want to do something different, and how did they want to do it? So that meeting was on March 12th of the election year of 2020, and as it worked out, Biden called Ted and said that asked him, "Do you think it's time to start the transition?" And Kaufman said yes, he thought it was. And so he said he wanted him to, he and Mark to think about what they might do, what were the important issues. And of course, appointments was prime among them. And so they met in the 22nd of April. Kaufman and Biden met at the Tatnall School, which was nearby Biden's house. And currently, at that time, the campus was vacant. And they walked around and talked. And they talked more that evening with Mark, and then the next day they spent I think it was something like 5 hours between the 2 days discussing it, and how they were going to do what was going to be important. And one of the first things that Biden said was that he wanted a diverse federal government service and a diverse White House. And so that was laid out right at the start. And then they after they met on the 22nd. Then he wanted recommendations on how it should be structured and who should run it. And Kaufman and Gittenstein talked to people and thought that Jeff Zients would be a good recommendation. And Biden knew Zients from the Obama administration, and Zients was in place by the end of April. So here, starting early meant really putting together a framework, deciding what their priorities were going to be, and then how to do it. One of the things that Kaufman and Gittenstein worked on were what they called unconventional challenges, and they guessed that that it was going to be a hard transition. Turned out to be a little more difficult than they anticipated. But what they wanted to do was do some thinking about what problems could they have, and that just thinking not just of the past, but of the current situation. What could they do? So they had Jeff Peck, who had worked for Biden, working on putting together information that they all came up with on what kinds of challenges that they could have. And so appointments was high among them. And what they thought was going to be important, because the PAS, the partnership, Kaufman said he looked at that partnership data and can see every year it gets worse and worse. So therefore, why not focus on the PA positions? Because if you wanted to get a fast start, then the way to do it was focus on PA and have your White House up and running by the time of the inauguration. When Clinton came in, he announced his senior White House staff a little more than a week before the inauguration. When the Biden people came in, they had 206 people named to the White House staff. And when you look at the offices in the White House, they had the assistant to the president level and the deputy assistant to the president level in all of the major offices. And in looking at it from more than a year later, you can see that most of those people have stayed. They have added, particularly at the special assistant level, and there's been some churn in the NSC and in the vice president's office. But generally, in most of the White House offices, you have continuity, which was not the case in the Trump administration. You had a great churn, such as in the National Security Advisor's office, and it makes an enormous difference in the continuity of policy to have people that you've thought, that you know, that you've worked with, and that you know about, that you think will fill those positions. And so starting early made a real difference in the shape of the White House. They also decided, and I think this affects appointments too in a secondary way, they decided to meet virtually. well, they didn't have too much of a choice with COVID, but they did. But that gave them an opportunity that earlier administrations have not had, and that is bringing people together from all over the country. So the number of people that you tap are enormous, because you could, for example, there was a guy, Doug Parker, who was an OSHA, California's OSHA person, who could get onto the 9:30 East Coast call time that they had in the labor agency review, because he wasn't at the office yet. So he participated. So you got people from all over the country, and not only did it save money that you could then use for hiring staff, but also it gave you a broad cross section of people, and it also allowed you to see what those people's thinking was like, and whether you'd like to pull them into the administration. And when you look at the people from that they appointed in posts and in PA posts and in PAS as well, they did take people who worked on the transition, as well as ones who had worked in the campaign, and those who had long experience, like Ron Klain with Biden. So that gave them several advantages, I think, that virtual transition. And I think that is going to be something, this whole approach of starting early and not assuming that you're going to get the help of the White House and the federal government, or if you do, that it might be late, that the Biden's decisions, early decisions of really thinking through the structure of their transition and where it came in was important. So I'll stop now so we can get on to our next.
All right, Martha, thank you. That was a very interesting example of, of the most recent presidential transition, and how they attempted to navigate around some of the barriers and hurdles that were part of that transition process last year. There is one question in the chat that I wanted to get to from Stephen Sweeney, which was for John Duffy. I think, John, maybe you've seen that question too, about seeking guidance on what's the test for a principal officer using or for the significant authority that therefore only a principal officer can determine. Is it something like, the extent of possible financial and economic consequences, or is it what you were referring to in your remarks, effect on, significant individual rights and responsibilities?
So I think that the Supreme Court has used the phrase significant authority under the laws of the United States, not to describe what a principal officer has to deal with, but what any officer, what triggers a person's status as an officer in general. And that, I think, usually means that they have some binding legal effect on other individuals, but inferior officers can do that work. Arthrex only says that they can't make the final decision, at least unless they're permitted to do so by a principal officer. So if there's an allowance by the principal officer that they can make that decision, then they can make a binding decision that has significant authority under the laws of the United States. They have to be an officer. They have to not be what's called in the Appointments Clause lingo and just a mere employee. But they can make those decisions. They do have to be subject to some review. And this brings in also Dick Pierce's question about what happens if, does the Social Security Administration now need to review 1 million ALJ decisions every year. ALJs are inferior officers. An earlier Supreme Court decision held. Can they make final decisions? And I think the answer is that they can if they're permitted to do so by a principal officer. That's, I think, the crucial test. And also the adjudications in the Patent Office were radically different than in the Social Security Administration, in that the agency was not participating in the decision-making process except through these adjudicators. Normal agency adjudication is usually private party versus the government. And that's true in Social Security. The private party seeking money, the government's going to give out the money and sort of has a staff position about how much money should be given out. Unusually, for the administrative state, the decisions in the Arthrex case were private party versus private party. And that creates a number of consequences that meant that the executive really wasn't, or the leadership of the agency weren't involved either in the adjudication, except through these inferior officers, and also were not necessarily involved in defending the decisions on judicial review. Those factors are just different with the Social Security Administration.
One can think of other agencies where that same thing might occur. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking about the NLRB, but I haven't thought of that analogy through enough, because often the NLRB is, defending some, prior decision, but sometimes it's the union versus the employer, or the employee.
It can look that way, but I think technically it's always the NLRB makes a decision as to who they think is in the wrong.
Right.
And they go after the party they think is in the wrong. And so the other party is there as like an intervener or as an amicus, and they're supporting the agency. But I think theoretically it's the agency is always going after whoever they think is in the wrong, whether that be the employer or the union or some other party. That, I think, is the way most agency adjudication is structured. But of course, at the NLRB, the heads of the NLRB are all principal officers. They're all appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. So the Arthrex decision doesn't rock the NLRB boat very much at all. Of course, if there's not a quorum, which is something we discussed before, then you've got a problem.
Right. Which previous Supreme Court cases address this issue of the president trying to circumvent that, or trying to deal with that quorum requirement, but not quite following the appointments clause. So anyway, this has been a really good discussion. I'm just checking to see if there are other questions that we should deal with in the chat. I mean, one of the another question that Dick Pierce raised is the question about the vitality of the Holding and Humphreys executor, about this, which was the case that decided that a four-clause removal restrictions on the president's removal power were permissible. And I guess, it's hard to know why Dick is asking this question, but I'm going to infer that he sees it as a way around this kind of these political stalemates on some of these multi-member agencies, especially if there's not a full complement of commissioners or board members. What do you think about that, John? Do you think Humphrey's executor is at risk here in this debate?
Well, I'm a skeptic of Humphrey's executor, probably not surprisingly, because I clerked for Justice Scalia, and he was not a fan of Humphrey's executor. On the other hand, I think getting rid of Humphrey's executor might make the problem worse. It just means that an incoming president can fire all the board members, and then you just have more vacancies to fill up. Now, maybe that would be a good thing, maybe that would be a bad thing, but it seems a little sideways to what we're discussing, which is how do you solve this problem of filling things up? And if the president does fire a bunch of independent officers, so that or at least fires all the ones of not of his party, then you lack a quorum probably. And if the Senate's controlled by your party, as it is today, well, maybe then you can fill them up. But you can't if the Senate is not controlled by your party.
Right, right, so can I go back to Bill for a minute and ask him, there have been several suggestions on the previous panel, and then your comments, suggest, and then also Paul's as well, some ideas about, the Senate itself, kind of reforming its procedures. How likely do you think that is to happen? I'll ask either Bill or Paul to comment on those things.
I think both Paul and I will say probably not very likely, but maybe Paul's more optimistic than I am. I think the key thing with the Senate is it evolves, it changes, and an administration needs to take advantage of where in the Senate things are working. And when there's comity on a committee, that's where you focus. Where there's bipartisanship working on committees, that's where you should try to focus. If you try to jam things on a committee that is just not going to work, or a floor process that is not just going to get you what you want, you can make a lot of political points, but you're not going to get people confirmed. And so the key thing is to understand where in the Senate the process still does work, focus on that, reward those committees and those senators who are working on a bipartisan basis, and then take the next step. Paul?
Well, I keep struggling with a way to count and create sort of almost a currency that involves the number of slots we're dealing with. There's nothing a Senate committee abhors more than being the lower committee on the poll. So, how many positions are we dealing with? How many layers are we dealing with? I just keep wondering whether or not we got but whether we could find a more powerful metric. I have a chart here. We've been monitoring this. We use the federal yellow books, which is basically the federal phone book, to count layers between the top of agencies and the bottom, looking only at Senate confirmed layers. I will tell you that there hasn't been a single research assistant ever on this project that has asked to do it twice. It is nearly impossible to go through the phone books and try to figure out whether there's a deputy associate assistant secretary here and whether that's equivalent to a deputy under assistant. You see what I mean? Any of us who have spent time looking at those books, it's just nuts. The question, of course, is whether somehow showing how these positions or layers are distributed, whether that would make any difference. I don't know. It really is shaming, a tool of shaming to show the committees what they've actually created. And there are some committees that have very clear chains of command through the executive branch, and others that don't have a clue regarding what they've done over the years. I'm just struggling with it. How do you wake a Senate committee up to the damage created by failed appointments, too many layers, and so forth and so on? We struggle with that. And then you come across saying, well, should we have a joint committee on appointments, layering, whatever? I mean, we all know of examples where the federal government has made humongous mistakes, life-threatening and life-claiming mistakes due to this process. Maybe we should be a little tougher on naming it. Maybe we ought to say, well, there were presidential appointees involved in the 9/11 event who weren't there, they weren't thinking, they weren't paying attention, or Congress did not take action that could have been taken. Should we name the ultimate price of this nonsense? Because right now it still seems, oh my gosh, there goes government again. We sometimes need to confront the way we talk about this, and it's a numbers game right now, but who gets hurt in it, I think, may be something we have to talk about.
Yeah, I see Max's hand up. He wants to get into this conversation, but it sort of reminds me of these articles that were, recently, maybe at the end of last year, the beginning of this year, about some of the inability of the public get their claims processed through the Social Security Administration, right?
Right.
Because of, the pandemic and the closure of offices, but, the lack of, Senate confirmed leadership at the head of it probably didn't actually help with kind of resolving that issue. I want to add to this conversation, and then we will be at time and I will wrap up. So Max can have the last word. Is Max still there?
I'm still here, and thank you so much, Renee. And just to build off of the comments from Bill and Paul, obviously this is uphill climb for everything, but I think maybe fair to end on a positive note and worth 2 points. One would be that in 2011, we did see legislation that actually passed to reduce the number of Senate confirmed positions. I would think that most people at that point would have been as skeptical of the opportunity for action as they are today. So it is possible, and we just had hearings from the Homeland Security Senate Government Affairs Committee, with Chairman Peters just not that long ago, and Chairman Peters has made public comments that he intends to introduce legislation to help address some of these issues. So, look, I think one of the most important things that this community can do is to try to keep this issue front and center, and to follow Paul's comments, to make it real for people beyond our community about what the impact is for all of us by not addressing this. But anyway, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for including me.
Thanks.
All right, well, this has been really terrific. I hope that I think I will wrap up now since we are at time. I want to extend our thanks to our audience who participated and for the really interesting questions that were offered to invite our panelists to elaborate on some of the ideas that were raised. I also want to join colleagues in thanking the Administrative Conference of the United States and the National Academy of Public Administration for really convening this interdisciplinary conversation about the intersection between law and, sort of the political science reality of how some of these institutions function. I think that's a really important contribution to the public debate. And then finally, without our really excellent and thoughtful panelists who've been working on various aspects of these issues for many years, please join me in thanking them so much for the continued work they do to try to inform the process and for enlightening us with their ideas this afternoon. Thanks very much.